Imagine being a world leader stepping into a meeting with the President of the United States, knowing you face a demand that goes not just against your country's laws, but its tradition too. Yet refusing him could fracture your country's most important alliance. That's exactly where Japan's Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi finds herself as she heads to Washington to meet President Donald Trump. With the Iran war disrupting global oil flows and hammering Japan's economy, Trump just can't seem to convince America's allies, including Tokyo, to help his efforts. In his frustration, he claims he doesn't need them anyway, yet he continues to call for their help. And meetings like this one coming up with Takaichi present an opportunity to apply pressure. Now, the visit was scheduled before the war and would have been a chance for Takaichi to celebrate her recent election victory and to reaffirm the US-Japan alliance. Now, it's turned into a test of how Japan can navigate a global crisis. So why can't Japan give Trump what he wants militarily? And what might it offer instead? To help us make sense of this, we're joined by one of the leading experts on Japanese foreign policy, Sheila Smith, of the Council on Foreign Relations.
But the very short answer is Japan has laws on the books that restrict the use of the self-defense forces, except for under very specific conditions, right? This derives, of course, from the government's interpretation of Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution.
I intend to make it clear that under Japanese law, what can be done will be done, but what cannot be done won't be done.
So she is not in a position of negotiating with the president. She said this already in the Diet in the Japanese parliament in response to questioning that under the current circumstances, Japan would be unable to deploy its military. And let me just give you what the specific circumstance is, and that is that this is the context of war. Japan has in the past sent minesweepers to the Gulf, and this was way back in the 1990s, and it did so in a coalition led by the United States, but it was in the aftermath of the conflict, not during combat or a war. So Japan is not in a position to do anything while the war is ongoing.
So that's a non-starter then, but Trump typically won't just take no for an answer. So how will Takaichi approach this, especially being the first leader to visit Washington among the allies Trump has called out?
The Japanese are going to be exploring with the Trump administration the purchase of Alaskan oil. In other words, this is something the Trump administration has advocated for in the past, and that is Japanese investment in the infrastructure in Alaska, including the consideration of a pipeline even, that would bring Alaskan crude to Tokyo and to other places in Asia. This is a very expensive project, right? Not just the oil itself, but the infrastructure support, right? This is a massive investment. So what is in the news in Japan today is that the government is working on an offer that would say, all right, let's consider Alaskan oil, and this would be good for Japan. We diversify our sources, less risky, comes, across the Pacific, not all the way across the globe. But also it would help the US-Japan partnership.
And then there's China. Takaichi is likely to build on this issue, on which both Washington and Tokyo might find common ground, especially over Beijing's posture towards Taiwan, which it considers its own territory.
So she has a position on the cross-straits relationship that is supportive of Taiwan. She has not been anti-China. She has not, in her political career, made a case out of criticizing Beijing. But a lot of her comments have to do with Japanese defenses, have to do with Chinese behavior in the region or towards Taiwan, are seen through that lens for her. So I think it's important when we think about the current turmoil between Japan and China is to position that first. She's not ardently anti-China, but she is not afraid. She's quite hawkish on Japan's own defense needs and the military requirements that China's growing military power require for the self-defense forces themselves.
The two leaders have already met in the past, but this time they'll be at the Oval Office, which has been a theater of sorts when some leaders have visited Trump.
You don't have the cards right now.
The Japanese leader will definitely be looking to avoid featuring in another dramatic White House episode.
Well, I think for Takaichi, of course, it's really important. She was riding high because the first Trump visit was when President Trump last fall went to Tokyo on his way to the APEC meeting where he was scheduled to meet with Xi Jinping. She had just been elected prime minister of Japan. It's within a week. And she was hosting the American president, which is a big deal, right? For any new Japanese prime minister, that meeting with the American president. He came to Tokyo. It was a bit of a love fest. I mean, the optics were fantastically positive for the alliance. They stood together as he went off to see Xi Jinping on the top of an American aircraft carrier. She looked a little bit like somebody out of Top Gun. She looked very comfortable in that military setting. It was very interesting for me to watch, not only as a Japanese woman in leadership, but also just as a Japanese prime minister, the level of comfort she had, right? So it conveyed what the Japanese wanted to convey as China was preparing to meet with Trump, but it was also a very good personal dynamic. I think this time it's more substance. Whether that good personal diplomacy, that vibe will continue to feed into the optics this time will be interesting to watch. This is harder territory because this is where there are real constraints on what she can do. Even though she has a massive electoral victory behind her, she can't change Japanese law when it comes to the deployment of military forces. And she has been very clear in Tokyo on this. She is not at the moment considering any kind of dispatch of the self-defense forces. If the war ends, then there's a maybe in that statement, right? At the end of the combat, at the conflict. But I think as long as this goes on, she's pretty safely protected at home by law. But whether or not President Trump appreciates that or not, I don't know.
And in the worst case scenario, what other options does Japan have, especially as the Iran war and the resulting economic strains continue?
I think it's interesting to say that the debates that are in the Diet are largely about, Takaichi coming to see President Trump, of course, but they're also about the relationship between Tokyo and Iran. And this is a relationship that many don't really appreciate, but there is a long-standing relationship between Tehran and Tokyo. Not sure it gives Japan a lot of leverage, but the conversation in Japan at the moment is, why isn't Takaichi negotiating with Iran for safe passage through the Gulf of Hormuz? I suspect because she wants to come and get her discussions with President Trump out of the way first before Japan is perceived as compromising, the situation in a way that the United States might not be pleased about. But as you may know, several countries have negotiated with Tehran, India first and foremost, Pakistan, I think Turkey. And so there have been several ships that have gotten safe passage. Iran, some of the leaders of the Revolutionary Guard in Tehran have been on Japanese television, interviewed by the national broadcasting, NHK. And they said, of course, we would consider, if Japan is not supporting the American war, we would consider safe passage for Japan. So there is some space here that's not just about the trip to Washington, but about the larger trade-offs for Japan in thinking through how it responds to this conflict.
But of course, the U.S.-Japan relationship has a long history with multiple elements, meaning this meeting will go well beyond the Iran war.
Well, I'll be watching the Alaska offer. I mean, I think that's we all expected this to be a very comfortable meeting where she could celebrate her victory and talk about the economic relationship. They were ready to tee up projects under that $550 billion FDI plan. So I think, again, that'll be there. And that'll take the starring role. What I'm going to be looking for is Japan and the United States also have to negotiate what's called a host nation support agreement in next year. And so I'm going to be watching for the reciprocity argument to reemerge in that policy area. I don't know how prepared the Trump administration is to take this moment beyond the economic relationship with Japan. Are they really going to be asking for other kinds of strategic military cooperation? I don't know. So that's what I'll be looking for. This president tends to focus on the economic dynamics more than any other president in the past. If it was a typical U.S.-Japan meeting, I would expect other kinds of security cooperation to also emerge to demonstrate how Japan contributes to the Indo-Pacific. And the last thing I'm going to be watching for is Chinese military activity around Taiwan has been on the uptick as we are all focused over there on the Iran war. I'm going to be looking to see just how much the focus goes back to the Indo-Pacific and what's happening in the Indo-Pacific. I think that's going to be an important piece of her talking points and her brief, is to get the president to not myopically focus on Iran, but to keep an eye on that Indo-Pacific theater as well, to make sure, right, that the United States is prepared in case there's any kind of mischief that might happen.
Takaichi will be hoping to leave Washington with something to show, not just on the international stage, but also to the Japanese public.
If she comes back having been embarrassed by Trump publicly, or having been the recipient of a tirade of why don't you allies do more in public, right? If there's any public display of ire, I think the Japanese people will be very unhappy. Whether they'll be unhappy with Trump or unhappy with her, I don't know. I think they'll probably be unhappy with Trump given the current mood around the Iran war. So I don't know how that will play out. But I think for her, this is really, really critical, and it's hard. This could go either way. Even though the Japanese government is very highly prepared for the complexity of the moment, this is a high stakes meeting for Takaichi and for Japan, for that matter.
And other US allies will be closely watching this visit to see just how they too can position themselves in the face of pressure from the world's superpower. We'll continue to follow every episode as it unfolds here at DW News. Thanks for your company. I'm Tomi Oladipo. Bye for now.